Good morning. Welcome to the art lecture series for winter. I'm going to quickly go over the lineup for this quarter. My name is Shah Osha. I coordinate this series. I have coordinated this series for close to 15 years. I don't even know how long. And in fact, today's speaker was here in 2012 and has returned. So it's very exciting. I know. Okay, so today we have Catharina Manchanda, who's the Curator of Contemporary Modern Art at the Seattle Art Museum. And then week 4, on the 29th of January, we have Eleni Stakopoulos, who is a writer of critical lyric essays and poetry. She will also be in person. And then in week 6, on the 12th of February, Christopher Paul Jordan, who is also here in 16 or something, a long time ago, and has gone off and gotten an MFA and will be coming back, but unfortunately not in person because he's in a residency, and he is a painter and a public artist and a joy. And then the last talk will be on the 26th, week 8 of February, Jonathan Neufeld, who's a professor of philosophy, and his subjects are music, aesthetics, politics, and sort of legal implications with aesthetics and music, I think. So we will hear from Catharina for about an hour, and then there'll be a Q&A for about a half an hour. So one of the reasons we invite people in person, or that we hold these together as a collective audience, even if it's on Zoom, is to have that kind of participation and not be just receiving information. And we have a lot of people in here who are going to be working on some way or another, thinking about a curated space or what that means. So hopefully you'll engage in discussion afterwards. And if you're on Zoom, if you put questions in the Q&A, then I'll catch those and read them out to Catharina. So we have Anna Sartwell-Corrales will come up and introduce Catharina. Thanks, Anna.
Hello, my name is Anna Sartwell-Corrales. I am a student of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, an interdisciplinary program that weaves together topics of literature, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and art under a Lacanian framework. Today, as a part of the Evergreen State College's running art lecture series, I'm pleased to introduce curator Catharina Manchanda. Catharina is originally from Germany, where she completed her BA in art history, English, and German at the University of Stuttgart. In 2005, she received her Ph.D. from City University in New York City, where she wrote her dissertation on conceptual art and photography in 1960s and 70s German art. Catharina has taken on several curatorial projects throughout her career, including a 40-year retrospective of Gerhard Richter's paintings at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, Beauty and the Blonde, an exhibit focusing on depictions of the blonde and American art at the Mildred Kemper Museum in St. Louis, Missouri, and most recently, Joyce J. Scott's Walk a Mile in My Dreams, a 50-year a retrospective at the Seattle Art Museum, which included almost 140 different works in various mediums, textile, beadwork, glass, sculpture, among others, and dealt with topics of race, sex, and the inheritance of cultural knowledge in, but not limited to, the Upper South. Manchanda's curatorial practice is critical and asks questions of why now and why here, and resists falling to exclusively singular official narratives or strict didactic approaches. I was excited to introduce Catharina today because I felt her approach, which is both critically interrogative while possessing room for multiplicity, resonates with my own art practice this quarter, which is personal and married to my historical and cultural context while exploring the concept of a fractured self, especially as it is repurposed, piecemealed, and digested on the internet. Online spaces can be sometimes thought of as a gallery of the self, where the individual is the first curator, destined to become further distilled to their essential qualities by onlookers soon to become curators themselves. Some viewer curators possess the ability to pick up the pieces of a self without generating rigid narratives in the absence of information, or attempting to reproduce a facsimile of a whole. There's always more than what is presented, always questions to be asked about the selves we broadcast to the anonymous void, which is almost always done without a void in mind, but rather a specific type of audience which we'd like to speak to directly. And in matters of art curation in the physical realm, I feel that Catharina possesses this ability. Catharina is currently the John and Mary Shirley Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Seattle Art Museum, and has been working with the museum since 2011, and will be talking to us today about curatorial practices. Welcome, Catharina.
Hello, everyone. This was such a generous introduction. Thank you so very much. And what you say, you know, there's always more than what is presented, is so very true. So thank you again. That was really lovely. The only thing I should say before I get started is, and is this too echoey? Should I stand back a little? Is this better for you?
It sounds good either way.
Okay. I just don't want to sound like you guys are in an echo chamber or something. You mentioned the Gerhard Richter show. Those were my humble beginnings as a curatorial assistant. So the curator was Robert Storr, a real mentor to me too. We'll touch on that later on, but thank you again so much. Well, as I was putting together my notes for this talk today, and thank you so much to everyone for inviting me back, I thought to myself, this should be so easy talking about curatorial practices today. After all, this is what I do every single day. But when you take a step back and reflect on where we are, it's a rather complex landscape. And really, I feel curatorial practice is forever a work in progress. But let's start with a few things and have a little bit of fun here. In recent years, when exactly I can't pinpoint, but somewhere I would say within the last 10 or 15 years, maybe a little more, the word curator has caught on fire. Somehow it has become ubiquitous within popular culture. What you see on the screen right now, the curator, is a coffee shop, bistro, restaurant, I don't know what, at Heathrow Airport. In fact, I believe it is a chain because I encountered another shop like that in a railway station in London, so it must be some kind of a British chain, and it's not just the curator, it is the curator if you look closely at the italics. And it's one of the ways in which I want to start this conversation. You know, in the popular imagination, what do people actually associate with the term curator, or what people perhaps mean or imply by it? Some of you may have seen the Marvel Comics movie, the Black Panther, a couple of years ago. A curator started in a rather infamous role in the opening sequences. Does anyone remember seeing this film? All right, just a handful of people. I thought all of you had seen this one. Anyhow, it's an example of the worst kind of curator. First of all, she has a kind of a private meeting with a visitor, African-American black man who walks in there. Well, probably not African-American, but a black man. We don't know much more at this stage in the movie. And she walks into the galleries. She is apparently a curator of African art with a cup of fancy coffee in her hand. That was the first thing that tripped me up. I was like, hello, nobody has like food and drink in the galleries. And then the second thing that happens in the movie, which of course is perfect for the drama, is that the woman is clueless about the work that's actually, you know, in her collecting area, material she should know about. So as you can imagine, I started watching that movie and I was like, some things don't sit right here, but it makes certainly for a fantastic setup to this otherwise very dramatic movie. And then has anyone seen the movie The Square? That was a year earlier in 2017. I see one or two hands. If you have not, I highly recommend it. It is painful, hilarious comedy, but really steeped in the, you know, discussions we're having around art and culture in a very heightened and socially and politically complex landscape right now. What could go wrong, right? You got to watch the movie. It's excellent. And so those were some things that happened recently, but it was not the movies that really made the term curator so terribly ubiquitous, I think, in popular culture. But I have a suspicion that it is the big international art exhibitions, the biennials. You may have heard of the Venice Biennial, one of the oldest international art exhibitions that takes place in Venice, Italy every year. Or you could look at Documenta, which is held in Kassel, Germany, every 4 or 5 years, and other biennials. In fact, there has been such a proliferation of these international biennial and triennial exhibitions all over the globe that they seem to be constantly in the news. And because these are exhibitions with supersized budgets, and the curators are standing, who are selected to curate those exhibitions, they tend to stand in the limelight. So, on the right-hand side, you have Simone Lee, who curated, who was the artist who was the representative of the American Pavilion a couple of years ago, who turned the American Pavilion into this African village very dramatically with one of her monumental sculptures in the foreground. And top left, another one of those spectacular interventions. In this case, it's the Guggenheim in New York. This was in 2011, Maurizio Catalan exhibition, an Italian artist who has a pretty wild and wily sense of humor, so he hung everything from the ceiling. That was his idea for retrospective. Anyhow, I think some of those things, and especially, rising auction prices, the way in which, these international shows, or even the Whitney Biennial or the Carnegie International, bring the curator into the foreground very often, that it's entered more of the mainstream. How much so, take a look at this, is kind of surprising. This is my random sampling from a couple of days ago. The brand curator, I have no idea what that is. There are, you get now also as a verb, curated cannabis and curated wine selections. One of my favorite is the hand-curated home. That one really puzzles me, because when I curate, I tend to use my brain mostly. I don't know where the hand-curated comes in. And looking at these things, it made me also realize, how, of course, this is all due to a marketing machine. So the question we have to ask ourselves, what is it with the term curator or curated that is so appealing that people think it will entice people to buy more products, that they roll out that term over and over again, whether it makes sense or whether it doesn't make sense. And it made me reflect back on how the term craft and crafted has undergone a similar debasement, if you will. I'm sure true craftspeople will be horrified to hear of handcrafted beer and many other things, even though skill is perhaps more implied in manual labor when we think of crafted. But I just wanted to gather these for you to prompt us and think about what does the term, curated, what is the appeal in popular culture. So based on those examples, does anyone want to venture a guess? What is the aspect of the curator or curated that seems to stand in the foreground? Yes, please.
I feel like it would make you feel better about that product if somebody else goes over it, hears it, and, processes it.
So why not edit it, right? Or why not, yes, go ahead.
Curated kind of implies like marketed, or like there's some sort of there's some sort of judgment or some sort of aspect of taste involved.
Taste, yes, that's definitely a great one. Yes, we have another.
It makes it seem like it's been picked by an expert.
Picked by an expert. I think you're getting very hot here. Yes, go ahead.
The fact that it's maybe derivative of cure, like it can solve your problems.
Ooh, I hadn't thought of that one. That's very interesting. I mean, my takeaway is it has something to do with a choice selection, right? Exactly this idea of somebody who has knowledge and taste in a certain area and brings you the choicest of morsels, and then you as the consumer will only get the best of the best. That, to me, seems to be the popular notion of what Curator in the marketplace seems to stand for. Now, I want to take a step back and just think about the original, some of the humble beginnings of what later on became a profession, and also the Latin origin of the word, because curare really means to take care of. So originally, a curator was a custodian, a caretaker, a steward, and that is a meaning that still prevailed, certainly in collecting museums. Although I would venture a guess that, in the way back days, a curator was perhaps more a combination of a conservator. Conservators are people today who are treating objects, cleaning them, repairing them if necessary, and what we understand today as a curator, namely somebody who studies the history, the context of a work of art, or movements, and can share that knowledge or information with others about the work of art. But what we have here on the screen is a wonderful painting. We have Archduke Leopold Wilhelm in his painting gallery, just as a reminder that the early beginnings of the museum, of course, start with the aristocracy. It's kings and queens and other aristocratic or privileged people with financial means who commission artwork, who collect it, and it's also a lovely reminder of how they actually displayed the art. It was not on white walls, one painting next to another, but it was a wild array of paintings, sometimes different styles next to each other. I mean, it's not like everyone displayed the work that way, but this is termed a salon-style hang, and was actually quite common. So the other thing I thought, because there's so much confusion in the popular arena around what a curator does or what curated might mean, that I thought it might be helpful to have a little overview here. There are many types of curators, and I'm only talking about art curators, not science or any other types of curators today. There are curators at a collecting museum. These can be public or private. I work at the Seattle Art Museum, which is a collecting institution. There are curators at Kunsthalle type institution. Kunsthalle is a German word meaning exhibition space, and they sprung up mostly after World War II. A lot of collections were either destroyed, missing, whatnot. So they started these exhibition spaces and started a new type of curatorial practice, which was just focused on curating exhibitions. So a person who is working at a Kunsthalle-style institution will only be in charge of researching, developing exhibitions, maybe working on publications and programs together with the education staff. But this is a person who will not be looking to acquire work and building a collection the way in which a collecting museum will do. And, and there are implications for that, because if you're a collecting institution, you're in a way building an archive that is also a legacy. These archives are fascinating for what they contain as much as what they do not contain, and yet they are also a basis from which you can, this is your collection that you can draw on every single day, rather than, if you're a Kunsthalle, you don't have a collection. That means every single artwork that's hanging on the wall is alone. That means it needs to be requested from another museum or a private individual. It needs to be packed, crated, shipped. This is very expensive, as a matter of fact, more so now after the pandemic. And then the curators that tend to be the fabulous, glamorous curators, unlike my humble self, who are hired to organize the big biennial or triennials. They are the ones that we associate with the jet-setting curators who fly all over the globe, who visit artists from Brazil to India and anywhere in between to put together the next fabulous exhibition, perhaps meant to be a global survey of art that is relevant today. So the kinds of curators who curate biennials, they might have a regular job at a big museum. As a matter of fact, I just read that Naomi Beckwith, who's the chief curator at the Guggenheim Museum, was just picked to curate one of those big international exhibitions, I think the next Documenta in Kassel. And I don't know, she'll need a sabbatical and a huge amount of staff because, you know, you can't just do that on the side. That's a massive job. And then, of course, you also have the university museums. Especially here in the United States, many universities, including all of you here at Evergreen, have an art gallery, and that can be used for different purposes. And I believe some of you are planning to curate an exhibition in that space. Are there people here who are, yes? All right, that's excellent. Can't wait to learn more about that. And we'll talk more about that as well. So some of the university and colleges may have collections. I was not long ago reminded when I went to Yale. Yale University has one of the most jaw-dropping collections you could imagine, better than any museum could ever dream of. If you have an interest in, let's say, early 20th century European art in particular, but also African and Asian art. But many other colleges and university museums simply have a gallery as a space to play with. It's tied in with seminars. It's an opportunity to really hone a very different skill set. And I think you all are in a fabulous situation if you're going to experiment with curating an exhibition. So let's talk a little bit about shifting frameworks and concerns. What I want to do in this little presentation is to think about some of the big shifts, and truly these are just a few examples. We would need an entire seminar to delve deeper here, but a few examples that I perceive as big shifts in how we think about curatorial work in the contemporary realm. And then following that, because we are looking at some of the pressure points that are shaping this very particular cultural sphere in which we're working today. And then if you're interested, I can share a couple of my own thoughts of things I've learned over the years and criteria and thoughts that are important to me personally. So one of the today behemoths in the United States, and by the way, I should also caution, if we talk contemporary art, I mean, the biggest beef is how in the world do you define contemporary art? For some people, the contemporary is simply what artists are making now, what living artists are making now, and that's the contemporary. There has been so much published about both museology and curating in the last 15 or 20 years. You can fill half a library with it. And Claire Bishop's, it's kind of a little essay, Radical Museology is a nice entry point too if you want to look at, a couple of different materials in this regard. And she is summarizing in this really relatively short essay a couple of the more conceptual approaches, how some of the philosophers I've been thinking about the contemporary as actually an atemporal place through which to curate. There's some, obviously nuances, and it's quite fascinating to think of it through this theoretical lens right now. But I want to start right now with just reminding ourselves, contemporary art, if we're just looking at artistic practice right now, is obviously a worldwide phenomenon. And I've always found it absolutely bizarre in this country that people talk about a curator of contemporary art as somebody who should actually be able to cover the entire globe. I think that's preposterous. We are all a product of, you know, the sum total of who we are, what we've learned, the kind of cultural context in which we are growing up. And if I want to do, you know, an exhibition about African art, African contemporary art, I would have to have a much better context. I would probably want to have a colleague who knows the history and is steeped in that material. All this to say is that I want to focus, you know, in my little overview, mostly on a Western context, Europe and the United States, also because they have long been shaping the conversations. But obviously, when you think about contemporary art, it's a global practice. And if you take 10 curators, you will get 10 entirely different answers in terms of the criteria and what is important to them. So please keep that in mind. I don't want to misrepresent here. So shifting frameworks and concerns. If you think about the United States, the Museum of Modern Art was a pretty incredible undertaking when it was founded in 1929. I don't know how many of you know that it started with the Rockefeller Mansion there on the block between 53rd and 54th Street in Manhattan. It was a brownstone, and the first gallery was actually in that building. I should have brought a photograph of the Philip Johnson building that became iconic subsequently. Architect who really incorporated that sense of an international style of architecture, you know, glass front, white walls, all the aesthetics that a lot of people associate today with the way in which contemporary art is presented in many, if not most, contemporary institutions. And on the right, of course, you have the zoop-de-doop, fantastic new entrance of the expanded Museum of Modern Art that just reopened a couple of years ago. Has anyone been to New York and in that building? A couple of people have. Yes, I mean, it is vast. You can easily spend an entire day there. And this, however, is just a museum dedicated. It still calls itself the Museum of Modern Art, even though, you know, we have kind of long eclipsed the moment of the modern, and there too are deep, deep fights and strong convictions over, you know, does the modern endure, or were there seismic shifts in the 60s with, you know, structuralism, post-structuralism, different types of ideas. And I think there is a shift, because if you think about how the modern was understood, you know, in the early decades of the 20th century, it posited the sense that it was a radical break with the past, you know, wanting to have nothing to do with, you know, what came before, but realizing in its aesthetics, in its focus on, you know, destroying perspectival space. If we start with, you know, ideas around cubism, I apologize, I'm throwing some terms around that I'm not illustrating, but it's positing the new, and he was very optimistic. It tied in to some extent with a certain utopianism of how these new modern aesthetics would be shaping the future. The Museum of Modern Art also has a large design department, and you can go there. They have amazing collections of the modern kitchen and new kinds of economies. I mean, it really all ties together. And then at the bottom, just an example of, you know, one of their exhibition displays. So this is the sort of aesthetic that I think a lot of us are taking for granted when, or no longer questioning this notion of the white box, which was actually a radical invention that came along with, you know, museums of modern art such as this one. All right, I'm going to fast forward here to the 1960s. So in the 1960s, you have, of course, suddenly a huge shift. And again, I'm looking especially at North America here. Andy Warhol, that enfant terrible, and I think some of you are taking the seminar right now on the symbolic and the real, will be familiar because I know you're touching on Andy Warhol as well. This idea of, you know, a child of Polish immigrants from Pittsburgh who came to New York working in the advertising industry and then seized on the idea of mass production and consumption and started to make these silkscreen paintings of everyday staples such as Campbell's soup or, you know, other items like Brillo boxes of cleaning materials, all the way to, you know, the stars of the movie screen, Marilyn Monroe, or later on Elvis and others, that he was glamorizing. And the other extraordinary thing that Warhol, of course, was doing is playing with this idea of repetition and the fact that ordinarily you think of repetition as in art as something lesser, right? If it's one, it's unique, it's precious. If you repeat an image more than once, it would be an addition or something, it would be less valuable. But he tied it in very smartly with a completely new consumer society. And you can also go back to Walter Benjamin's writing on ideas of the aura in art. Rather than the repetition canceling things out, he really demonstrated how he can enhance the aura if something is viewed over and over and over again, and of course also reproduced at a much larger scale. So the little can of soup becomes a much larger item on the wall. Other things happening in the 1960s is conceptual art, something near and dear to me when I started out my studies in, my 20s. Joseph Kosuth, this 1 and 3 chairs that you have in the middle there, is an example of a real chair, a reproduction of a chair, and a description, a dictionary description of a chair. So kind of playing with this idea of what is presented, what is represented, and the slippage between these things. And then most notorious of all, perhaps, on the right, Robert Morris and other artists of the minimalist camp moved away from paintings, and sculptures of old, such as the Léger that you have at the bottom, and in the middle you have like your Brancusi sculpture. These are, the Brancusi sculpture in the middle is something you can walk around. It's something you can kind of take in easily, and you have a very particular relationship to it. Kind of you're in command with your visual apparatus. But what happens if an artist is coming up with these weird beams and blocks that are blocking your way in the exhibition space, and you have to navigate that space? On a sudden, it becomes more of an environment that you have to navigate. And at the time, people had very mixed feelings about that. Notably, Michael Fried, who in his 1967 article, Art and Objecthood, took aim at minimal art, such as this one. And because he felt that art was all of a sudden, with such interventions, moving into the realm of the theatrical. So to quote Michael Fried, the literalist espousal of objecthood amounts to nothing other than a plea for a new genre of theater. And theater is now the negation of art. That was pretty fighting words there. So rather than art being a world unto itself, a gestalt that is self-contained, think about a painting in a frame, or, as I just showed you, a Brancusi sculpture that is kind of your scale, that you can easily take in as a single form. Fried objects to scenarios that now include the viewer, spaces that the viewer traverses. And while, Fried was kind of regarded as a conservative, perhaps, at that time, you know, holding on fast to modernist ideals. The essay has remained very much on people's minds to this day, because subsequent developments kind of resurface this idea of the theatrical, especially when it's combined with the spectacular. As I said, I'm just picking, you know, a number of examples. One could pick so many others. However, in the late 60s, there was a Swiss curator by the name of Harald Seemann. Some of you may have encountered him before. And he started out working at a Kunsthalle in Bern, Switzerland. And sometimes there's a real advantage when you're working in these small spaces, because he can just fly under the radar. If people just give you a budget, and at that time, first of all, Europe doesn't have any trustees and big oversight, he could simply have fun and do some really wild things. So he did an exhibition that became legendary, When Attitudes Become Form: Works, Concepts, Processes, Situations, Information. And on the left, you can kind of see this very bare bones catalog with it. Nobody would allow you to publish a catalog like this today. That will not be flying off the shelf, nor was even concerns of, you know, how to sell something like that on his or anyone's mind at that time. And what you see on the right is just an installation photograph from that original exhibition. It is exactly these kinds of both conceptual and minimal precisions that he was looking to show. And he absolutely, you know, shocked the, you know, citizens of Bern, who presumably had somewhat more traditional tastes when it came to art, with installations like this. I think one of the artists had a telephone installed in the middle of the gallery with a little, you know, plaque on it that said, if the phone rings, you know, the artists on the phone pick up and speak to them. Other interventions were like releasing slightly radioactive substances from the roof of the museum, to kind of show that sculpture could be something invisible, that could expand, you know, into the infinite, that could also be more in a liminal space. These were radical ideas at that time. And he subsequently, I didn't bring a photograph of that, but what made him even more well-known is that in 1972, and this was my larger context for my dissertation way back when, he did an exhibition in Kassel. So it's one of those large international exhibitions, so a big platform. It gave him an opportunity to really, well, introduce himself to a much larger and international audience. He had done a couple of other quite notorious projects leading up to this, but he was hired to do this 1972 international exhibition. And what he did there was he did this huge survey of visual culture and collected representations from everything. What is printed on, can I even say, your money, your bills anymore, because now everything has gone digital, to advertisement posters, to pornography, to garden dwarfs, any number of things in the visual sphere, the kind of thing that you would, today you would simply pick up your phone and look at the visual culture that is just brought to your fingertips digitally. But for him, it was a way of kind of surveying how different kind of aesthetics and oftentimes symbolic meanings, especially if you look at currency and what different countries print on their currency, political posters, the color choices, the eagles appearing in different corners, or what have you, asking people to take all that in, and then in contrast to this huge conglomeration of the everyday visual culture, materials, and aesthetics, were then different artistic practices that emphasized quite radically different approaches, including minimalism in conceptual art, a lot of performance art, ephemeral, right, that you had to be there to witness it. Most of these things weren't even recorded at that time. I don't know how many of you have heard of Joseph Beuys, a German artist that he was a huge champion of, who espoused the persona of the artist a bit like a shaman and healer, and made works that were really rooted in performances as well along those lines. So it was just material that was quite stunning to many people, especially in the general public, who weren't following these new trends very closely. So Harald Seemann, what he did with exhibitions like these, he took a point of view. So in the past, those big, national exhibitions, it was more perhaps a curator thinking about, what is the best of the best right now, moving more in the territory of historical developments, the recent past, but there was something utterly new. I mean, he was almost the curator in the role of an artist, a dreamer at times, a fabulist, somebody who's putting things together in a very new way. Some artists actually objected. Robert Smithson, I recall, retracted his artwork, and simply the letter of protest was then reprinted in the catalog, and embracing all of that was part of this freewheeling exhibition. And just to point out, these big international shows are not the only test cases for new ideas. At the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Kinnison McShine, the first black curator who worked at the Museum of Modern Art, organized a very famous exhibition called Information in 1970. And it was also a way of grappling with these new developments. It's not like, it's only these Biennale curators who are tackling the most recent and new. And I'm just showing you the photograph in the center. Robert Smithson was an artist who we today affiliate to some extent. He's kind of between conceptual art and what was termed land art. He wanted to move far beyond the space of a museum or a gallery, and made this crazy and gigantic spiral way in Utah at the Great Salt Lake. I'm not exactly sure what it looks like right now, because I think the lake keeps drying up. He even hired a helicopter and made a film about it. He had these pretty amazing ideas about also the not just cosmic ideas of time that are also implied in the spiral, but wanted to relate this outdoor installation, bring it in a dialogue with what is happening, what you can present almost as documentation or information in a gallery. So this active dialogue is something he expanded on in subsequent works, not all of them as huge as this one. But that's one example of the kind of material that would have been presented in this exhibition. Or on the right, Hans Hake with a visitor survey about how they might be voting in an upcoming exhibition for Nixon. It was about Indochino policy at that time, very political and spicy. I'm sure this would be much harder to realize in museums and galleries today, especially since it called out Governor Rockefeller, and MoMA, after all, was founded by the Rockefeller family. All right, the other thing I want to just think about as we hop along here. So we started with Seemann in the late 60s and early 70s. What is happening in the 80s and 90s? So opening in 1985, and this is just one of many examples, is the Saatchi collection in London. Now, Charles Saatchi was somebody who made his money in, he was kind of a media and advertising executive, and he built a huge art collection. In fact, initially, he was very much enthralled with Donald Judd. The photograph on the left with these kind of big box-like shapes are works by Donald Judd, and that was the inaugural exhibition in 1985. Now, this is the same material that looked very humdrum, right, in the original iteration. And all of a sudden, in the span of a couple of decades, minimal art has become highly priced. It's become a collectible, even though it's work that really responds to space. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about the installation of some of those works, but that's something else. And subsequently, so at the surface, you could say, the Saatchi collection in its, in what they do, looks not that dissimilar from what an art museum does. But, collectors, don't necessarily stay with, a single body of work, certainly not Charles Saatchi and the Saatchi collection, because they subsequently bought a lot of new work. In fact, they prized themselves on promoting the work on what became termed emerging artists. It's a fabulous marketing term too, although we all use it. Emerging artists, meaning much like emerging markets, right? Young artists or little-known artists who are just coming to the attention of a wider art world. And so the Saatchi collection did a large show of a group of artists, some really wonderful artists in the early 90s that became known as the Young British Artists. At the time, Damien Hirst was one of the enfants terribles of this particular group. His animals and sharks and formaldehyde you may have seen before, but there were, in his earlier work, there was a real social and political punch, especially when it comes to, the science and industry and the way in which, we think about pharmaceuticals, how we numb ourselves. He did some really astounding works early on. But as time goes on, and I just want to give this as a third example, auction houses became more and more intertwined with the contemporary art world. In the 1960s, nobody cared about contemporary art. I mean, people were just excited if the work could be shown. There wasn't a huge amount of money in it. But as auction houses realized, especially things that are bright, that are colorful, by the 80s and 90s, people are moving away from all this conceptual and ephemeral and dematerialized artwork that had been dominating the second half of the 60s and 70s. And painting and sculpture is so much more attractive to sell. And Saatchi, along with many other people in this country, you could think of the Rubels, who have a big collection in Miami and just opened a huge warehouse, and so many other people, the Rachowskis in Dallas, Texas. You could compile a huge list of collectors who also open up exhibition spaces, not just to house their work, but I'm sure if they open up their doors to the public, there might be a little tax incentive there as well. But the bigger part is they can become tastemakers, right? They collect art. So in the 80s and 90s, there were waves. What you see is really a huge rise in the art market as an industry and collecting works of art as an investment. Not because you have a deep interest in a particular artist and their ideas, but it is more, well, I could have something beautiful in the house. It's a little more cumbersome than stocks and bonds, but it's speculative. It could become really valuable. Now imagine if you're somebody who suddenly has a name, who has a large gallery, and who then collects these emerging artists and shows them right at the same time. Well, their wealthy friends, some of whom might be trustees at museums, see it, may want to jump on the bandwagon. You can see how it can lead to a real tight intertwinement between, what the market is excited about, because the market sells whatever they can sell, rather than the cultural value and importance of a work of art. Those two are not necessarily aligned. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And then in the early 1990s, and I see that in the rearview mirror, perhaps as not surprising that all of this developed in the early 90s, just at a time when the art market is just roaring. And I mean, even though we think of the 80s and 90s as, the time when this big push to commercialization was happening, it's nothing compared to what you see today. I don't know how many of you are familiar with huge warehouses in different locations. They are, wealthy individuals from around the globe who have their artwork stored in so-called, freeports, thank you very much. I was just skipping a beat here. And so they might never see the light of day, and they're simply stored, preserved in perfect condition until, the market changes and people feel now is the right time to sell the art. But in 1992, you have artists such as Rikrit Tirvania on the left, who started something entirely different. Cooking a meal. This is in a commercial gallery, 303 gallery in New York at that time, and proposing that, the humble act of preparing a meal, sharing it with friends or a small group of strangers, could lead to a very different kind of social and aesthetic exchange. What happens in that moment? What happens in that moment when you're present and simply having this shared experience? Or think about somebody like Carsten Höller, who in the late 1990s created this insane spiral slide at PS1 in New York. PS1 today in New York is part of the Museum of Modern Art, but it used to be the place where you had the most experimental art happening. It had a very different atmosphere and a curatorial objective with some very visionary curators there. So the idea of the slide was, what could be more disruptive, in terms of your expectations of what a museum is, than having this wiggly slide that goes down there. I've been there many times when that slide was still installed. I refused to go down there because I was really afraid I would get stuck in it. Plus, I could see the conceptual intervention, and I felt I didn't have to put myself through that little mouse hole in order to experience it. But there was, artistically speaking, it was I would call it an intervention. And, let me just find my notes here. It's, so it's a year before Carsten Höller. Let me just go back one more time. It's a year before Carsten Höller does this installation that Nicolas Bourriot, a curator and theorist, from France, published a book called Relational Aesthetics that was looking to capture these and similar types of phenomena that he was noticing, namely a shift in artistic practices. So in addition to the many traditional art forms that had been, established up to that point, he noticed and described the following: a set of artistic practices which take as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context, rather than an independent and private space. Now, this sounds innocuous enough. With these new developments in contemporary art, Bourriot understands artists as facilitators of interactions and exchanges, as we just saw. There was a hopeful, almost utopian element in his proposal, in the sense that the artist transfers agency and power to the audience, an instance of social empowerment. On the screen are these two examples that I just mentioned. So it was a way to perhaps pull back and ask more fundamental questions about the social value of art and how we, come together around art. And then a couple of, a decade later, roughly in 2009, the Guggenheim Museum in New York organized a show called The Any Space Whatever, that sought to capture and provide a platform for the kind of artist who Bourriaud had characterized in his writings a decade earlier. And I'm quoting from the museum's announcement of the exhibition at that time. During the 1990s, a number of artists claimed the exhibition itself as a medium. Working independently and in various collaborative constellations, they eschewed the discrete aesthetic object in favor of the exhibition environment as a dynamic arena, ever expanding in its physical and temporal parameters. For these artists, an exhibition can be a film, a novel, a shared meal, a social space, a performance, or a journey. Using the museum as a platform for projects that reach beyond the visual arts, their work often commingles with disciplines such as architecture, design, theater, engaging directly with the vicissitudes of everyday life to offer subtle moments of transformation. End of quote. What changed in the Guggenheim show, and by the way, this here is a bed. You could spend the night at the Guggenheim Museum. Whoops, did I skip over something? There should be, it's skipping over. Oh yeah, no, I've got it. Yes, the other one was an intervention, presumably at night, everybody with lights coming together, changing the mood in the space. So there were any number of, there was a whole kind of beanie bag situation where you could watch movies, hang out. It was a different way to occupy the museum as a viewer. You know, you're no longer just quietly walking around the galleries and looking at art. But what changed was really the scale of the museum and how all of these works were shown. So that was here, and it jumped ahead. Well, I guess I can jump to, fast forward in the landscape we're finding ourselves in. Because if you cook pad thai, I'm talking about scale here, pad thai, as Curator Vania does, for a small group of people, such as, the humble beginnings in the gallery in the early 90s, and you have a meal together, that is one scenario. But what you have here, bottom right, he was hired to set up one of these lovely interactive environments at Art Basel, which is one of the huge art fairs where art is sold. This is not an exhibition. Art is sold inside that building from all over the world. And, it had a lovely designed roof and structure. And I was actually there at that Art Basel. And I just thought, this fails. This becomes terrible at that scale, because what is happening is everybody is just treating it as, the caterers, the food court. There is no intimate space. People are just making deals on the side and are chatting with their friends. They're not even aware that this is meant to be an artistic intervention. And this was also an example singled out by James Voorhees, for those of you who looked at the introduction to his really, I think, very helpful and thoughtful book called Beyond Objecthood. If you look at what the New Museum did not long ago in, I'm trying to remember the exact date, I think it was within the last 10 years. They did a solo exhibition of Kastenhöller, so the slide reappears. By the way, I think there might be some people here in the room who were there who went to that show. Shaw, did you go to that? People had to sign, of course, release forms, contracts in case you got hurt. That didn't happen in the old PS1 building. There was, a little, festival-like atmosphere in other places, such as the piece bottom left. It felt strangely sterile, right? It was like everything was so perfect, so clean, but this idea of a rupture wasn't happening, certainly not for me at that point in time, when you're trying to scale things up and put things that are really meant to be in a different type of environment into a large museum. So, of course, what we're up against, if we're thinking about curating today, and, we're entering kind of this realm of the spectacular, if you're curating an exhibition and you're trying to get people excited about art, this is what you're competing with. Things like the Van Gogh experience. I think there's also been a Monet experience and, I don't know, Dali and various others. So instead of the actual painting, which is, in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and I know it, for some reason, there's so many Vincent van Goghs out there. It's a nice painting. It's not his best, let me tell you, but it is a very nice painting. But this obviously is then what inspires entire environments that you can move through. And what's even better is you can bring your phone, you can stage yourself and your friends, and you propagate and inadvertently market what is happening, because surely you're going to post this on Instagram, TikTok, or somewhere else. This is kind of the realm of the hyper-spectacular, augmented also by our use of social media, our love of computer games and, gaming together in clusters. This too is part of our contemporary environment. But one more step back to an exhibition that really had big ripple effects in 2002. That year, Okwi Invezor, a brilliant curator from Nigeria, was the first curator of color asked to organize the big Documenta exhibition. That's a big international art exhibition in Germany that takes place every 5 years or so. And he took a very different path. He established a critical dialogue with the institutional power of the global exhibition model, its Eurocentric and voyeuristic gaze, and really started something completely different. It was called Universes in Universe. And the way he went about this exhibition is he had a curatorial team. It was not a single curator, the all-knowing whatever. And they had 5 platforms, one in each continent, starting a year before the exhibition opened. So there was Democracy Unrealized in Vienna in 2001, Experiments with Truth, Transitional Justice and the Processes of Truth and Reconciliation in New Delhi, India. There was Créolité and Creolization in St. Lucia, and Under Siege, 4 African cities, Freetown, Johannesburg, Kinshasa, and Lagos. So those were all places where people came together, had intense discussions around all of these topics, and then the exhibition that took place in Germany was simply the culmination that also included findings. It was a complete, it was really a seismic shift, and it really told a story, of criticality, both vis-a-vis the institution and how one might go about thinking about art in the contemporary realm. Oh wait, I'm skipping ahead. So it was a bold and globe-spanning proposal, and it was an important wake-up call and a corrective. And one could really say that subsequent curators, especially curators of these large exhibitions, were very much inspired by it, whereas Okwi Invezor himself continued to create many incredibly important exhibitions, including the Apartheid in South Africa exhibition and the role that documentary photography played during that time period. He became the curator at Haus der Kunst in Munich, and I think this is where this particular exhibition originated, although I was lucky enough to get to see it in New York, where it's at the International Center of Photography at that time. So one of the takeaways, apart from Invezor introducing completely different artists who, had been entirely overlooked in the West, who were also completely outside of the marketplace, who addressed themselves to social and political ills. That was the first big corrective. But the other one was to really point out this glaring blind spot within the existing international exhibition system that had always been predicated on Western tastes, took place in Western institutions and countries. Of course, subsequently, nowadays you have biennials and triennials all over the globe. So a lot has changed since that. So I want to transition into our conversation in a minute. Artists at all times, of course, respond to the world we live in, and the social and political pressures we have been witnessing in the last decades have also given rise to a proliferation of art as social and political protest. The reckoning with colonial histories, the oppression of people of color, of women, the genocide, oppression, or marginalization of indigenous groups and practices, exploitation and trauma on so many levels, not to mention a looming climate crisis, have been urgent topics for many artists and for curators as well. But curatorially speaking, scale and pacing and a discerning eye not only for important and pressing subjects, but a rigorous questioning of what and how a topic is presented, I find critically important. A curator can inadvertently fall into a different kind of trap. Dean Kissick recently wrote an essay for Harper's Magazine called The Painted Protest. It was published in December 24, so just about a month ago. And in this essay, with which I have a number of issues, but he rightly makes one observation, and that is that large exhibitions of the biennial, triennial type over the last at least 5 years, if not more, have focused so singularly on social justice issues that the repetition, I shouldn't say repetition, that the presentation of hundreds of artists, each and every one calling out a different social ill, a different kind of trauma, a different kind of problem that we really need to address in society, can lead, curatorially speaking, in one space or sometimes spread out over multiple buildings, to an uncanny sameness. And that's really the opposite of what artists certainly want to achieve for their work, and also curatorially speaking, this is not what you want viewers to take away, because you want people to appreciate what each and every artist is contributing to the larger conversation. So there's a lot we could say, about all of these different things, but this is kind of my rough sketch, an outline of some of the pressures we're dealing with. So here you are, as a curator, you want to curate contemporary art. And I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask yourself, what are the criteria you bring to bear, when you enter that arena? And, the wonderful thing is, if you have an experimental space, it is a safe space. You don't have the scrutiny of world press on you, as does somebody like Okwi Envezor if you're looking to open a mega exhibition. Exhibitions are a way to think visually. There are opportunities to think about everything that is less evident. I think I need to back this up a little bit. Let's start with, when you're curating, it's really important to know who you are. Who are you curating for? What is the context in which you're working? If I'm doing an exhibition here in the Pacific Northwest, it will be a different place, a different audience than, say, if I'm curating in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or if I were doing an exhibition in New York, right? You have very different audiences, you have different histories, you want to be mindful of that. And then as a curator, I find, you tend to ask yourself over and over again, what are the questions, what are the aesthetic sensibilities, what are the issues that, or the artists that you really feel urgently need to be brought in front of your, publics at this moment in time. And that changes, right? The other thing that I think is really helpful to remember is, and I'm somebody who grew up in Germany. I came, from a very specific cultural context to the United States. So early on, the work I was able to do with Robert Storr at the Museum of Modern Art centered on a German artist who painted a larger cycle of paintings known as the October paintings. And it was a controversial topic in 1989 when he painted these events that had taken place in 1977, because it concerned the deaths of members of a well-known terrorist cell in Germany. They had been, they started out with grand ideals, but devolved into extreme violence. Many people got killed. And several of them died the same night, October 18th, 1977, in a prison, which raised all sorts of questions. Was it a collective suicide? Was it a state-instituted murder? The photograph top right in, Gerhard Richter paints in these deliberately very, I'll just say, blurry ways, right? Because he's always critical of the media and how you have to look through a screen in order to work your way into an image, to question the images too. In any case, this was a solo exhibition that preceded the large Gerhard Richter retrospective, and I was able to work on both of those. This was material I knew really well, that I had a close relationship to. In fact, Stammheim, the prison where these people were found dead in 1977, is just about half an hour drive away from where I grew up. So this is something I had a very close relationship to. And I think the other thing, and that's the point I was trying to make, it is very difficult, at times to speak on behalf of others. So knowing and perhaps becoming more humble in terms of what one can take on and what feels authentic to you, what you really have a particular relationship with, which is not to say you shouldn't be curious and think about everything that's out there, but, occasionally you might want to team up with a group of advisors. Let's say you want to do an exhibition of indigenous artists, here from the region. There might be expertise and knowledge that would be really important to draw from, to work collaboratively rather than independently. And so, speaking of context, I worked a couple of years in St. Louis. So moving from New York City to St. Louis was a bit of a culture shock for me, especially because I found the city incredibly divided along racial lines, and the kind of devastation in some of the areas of town was just something I couldn't quite fathom at that time. And speaking of the fact that you don't, sometimes exhibitions are an opportunity also to learn as you're working, learn, as you're going along. And there's certain things, I wouldn't say it was a failure, but I would say there are things that I would do very differently with what I know right now. Because being there, in St. Louis, this very strange and new environment to myself, being in the Midwest, where there was like so many young women who were all dyeing their hair blonde and had a very particular style, I kept chewing on the question, well, what is it with the blonde as a cultural phenomenon? I think we should unpack that as an exhibition. So the way I tackled it was I was looking at 3 different moments in time. I was looking at pop art, Marilyn Monroe. I had the original Barbie doll and a lot of ephemera in that exhibition. I looked at the 1970s, at feminist critiques, at conceptual artists, kind of unpacking and questioning that model. And the last section then turned towards artists of color, and how they've been both appropriating or pushing back against the notion of blondness or the blonde. And of course, this was, in a way you could say this is the elephant in the room, and you would, you might find it strange that I was so innocent at that time. But the fact that this entire subject, especially in this country, is so much predicated on questions of race, is something that just really emerged as I was researching and putting the exhibition together. So if I could do the show again, I would obviously organize it quite differently, with a very different emphasis, rather than having, these 3 different sections. But it's an example of, sometimes because you have all these different artists who are responding to something in a cultural context, and you want to keep an eye out for what these different things, because oftentimes these are then the questions that lend themselves to being unpacked in an exhibition. Another example of a show I organized when I came here to Seattle, I can't remember, was it 2013 or 14, was called Pop Departures. So I have, one of my long-standing interests has been in photography and media, especially the critical perception, how you question notions of representation. So this was another case where, because pop art started in the 1960s, I started with some of those early examples also, and this is something else you will grapple with if you ever work as a curator in a collecting institution. It's helpful if you can use your own collection as a starting point for developing exhibitions. It's smart. It's an opportunity to put it in a different context. It can also save you a little bit of money. Any number of reasons why you'd want to do that. So starting in the 60s, but then going more into the contemporary sphere, and I just have one installation shot at the right, Josephine Mexeper, American Mall, a piece that is kind of interrogating, through a mirrored environment, the many aspects of consumer culture. She's also a fierce feminist, and the kind of coded language that is being presented to you. And I included work, Amy Siegel is an artist who was scouring the internet at that time, YouTube videos, and she found men and women who were all singing, I did it my way, in their attics and their garages, and created this wild assemblage with it. Anyhow, it was an exhibition that allowed me to kind of look at the contemporary moment, but also bring a historical perspective to it. And I don't want to go on about myself really all that much, but you could say, what was perhaps unfinished business with the Beauty and the Blonde exhibition I did in St. Louis, I had an opportunity to think about other aspects when it comes to Black artists in the United States, with this trio of artists in an exhibition from, I think, 2016 or so, figuring history, the way in which Black artists address themselves to, both European and American history, and the visual manifestation. That was an exhibition I really enjoyed, and the show is still up until Sunday if anyone wants to go and see it. Let me just conclude by saying curating means endless study. I mentioned earlier I came from Germany. When I was starting out as an undergraduate, Adorno, the Frankfurt School, that was the Holy Grail. And I came to the United States. I got my Ph.D. in New York, it was all post-structuralism at that time, and perhaps psychoanalysis. It was a very different intellectual environment. And if you want to do meaningful work in this arena, you really have to be, dare I say, humble enough to admit that you have to be, eternally studying, that you want to be in conversation with a lot of different people, that you have to readjust your own worldview and criteria. I know Shaw and I were talking the other day. There was an article in Art Forum, a review of a 3-part book, a conversation between the critic and theorist Hal Foster and Benjamin Buchloh. Benjamin Buchloh is someone I know personally. He was and remains, a supersized figure within the context of art history, taught at Columbia University and elsewhere. And he held fast to, very particular criteria and principles all his life. And here he is, at the end of a very long and illustrious career. He was another big champion of Gerhard Richter, that German artist, of many of the conceptual artists of the 60s and 70s. In fact, I always joked, I attended an entire seminar. He never made his way out of the 60s, even though the course was built to be post-war and contemporary art. It was hilarious. We would always remain in the 60s and early 1970s. But and even in that review, it becomes clear you have a critic with very strongly felt convictions. Somebody who grapples with the very fact that, this idea of the critic as an individual person, in his case, a white male artist, has with a particular cultural background, has a very specific view, and and he's even questioning the role of the critic at a time when everything it has become open source. But the question for him then becomes, well, what are the criteria if essentially the market steps in and supplants, perhaps my own inadequate criteria with just whatever they can sell. There is a lot to consider there, but perhaps the takeaway is, let's be open and nimble enough to embrace change, certainly if you want to work in the arena of contemporary art. And now I'm going to stop, and I look forward to your questions. All right, let's hear it. Yes, right there.
I have a question about Gerhard Richter specifically. I did a project where I used his Townscape series.
Will you speak up a little bit more?
Yeah, or I can try to repeat it. It's a question about Gerhard Richter and the Townscape series.
More specifically, I was wondering about sort of his transition from like photo painting to sort of the more aestheticist stuff that he's been doing in like the past 15 years, because I don't really know. It seems like a very strange shift.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I was just wondering, since you did a whole retrospective on what you think of that.
Yeah, there are a number of shifts. We can also talk one-on-one afterwards, because this is a very specific question. But in a nutshell, there is a through line, certainly well through the early 2000s, where it is this engagement with this visual culture. You might be familiar. This is an artist who created what he termed Atlas. He created this huge visual archive. His own visual archive, collection of newspaper clippings, his own, photographs from, when he was traveling, things that might be in a still life genre, landscape genre, to kind of keep interrogating the different modes through which we're seeing. You know, why does this particular style of painting or photography look documentary to me, and something else has like this romantic inflection? So that moved him forward for a very long time, including the abstract paintings. But we can talk a little more. In the last, 10, 15 years, and of course I haven't, you know, I keep looking at what he's doing, but there have been a couple of other shifts too. I'd be happy to talk with you a little more. Other questions? Yes.
Just so you mentioned like the Van Gogh experience, and I just thought it was interesting that the only thing I've heard about it was how disappointing it was. But I've also never heard anybody say that about like viewing an original Van Gogh painting. So I think this is kind of a good example of how like making a spectacle of art can take something away from it. And I was just sort of wondering like how to capture people's interest without like making the art a spectacle or like taking something away from it.
Hold on, let me understand that. Do you mean about the Van Gogh experience or about?
I mean, like, since you're a curator, like if you have any, I don't know what was confusing.
Well, I mean, the fact that we're living in a highly spectacularized culture is a given, right? And I kind of gave that as an example of, you know, this is what you're competing with, right? I mean, you know, you're competing with Beyonce and Taylor Swift and, you know, the Van Gogh experience or other things that people are willing to pay a lot of money for, right, to go to. And it has a lot to do with, you know, how we like to engage, or a lot of people like to engage in public spaces, right? Something that is feeding perhaps not so much your imagination, which is where art is important to me, but perhaps being in spaces alone or with friends, something you can photograph and share with others to show what an amazing time you're having. So it operates in a somewhat different register. The part that's interesting about to me about that is how we can critically interrogate the spectacularized culture, right? How can you intervene? Who are the artists who are making interesting work around that? That would be the interesting thing for me. But I, you know, gave you this comparison between the actual Van Gogh painting. And as you say, the Van Gogh experience gives you no idea about what the materiality and the feel of this painting is really about. If you've been in front of a Van Gogh painting, it has like this thick painterly texture, and you can see every single brushstroke. And you can also see the odd things he's doing with color. He'll put something orange right next to a brushstroke that is green, and it makes your eye and your brain kind of sizzle in very unexpected ways. This is something, this kind of, we're delving, and it's not exactly the same painting, but it seems like repetitions of, it becomes this whole amorphous landscape. So curatorially, what interests me is the phenomenon of spectacular culture, where things are at, how we're interacting, how it is shaping the way we might see the work, and you know, and certainly, you know, people should also go to the Van Gogh experience, but please come to museums too. And when you go to the Van Gogh experience, I want you to have your critical radar up. I want you to think about the experience you're having and how it makes you feel. That would be my hope. Yeah, Kathleen.
Yeah, just to add on to this conversation, I'm thinking somehow when August was asking that question, I was thinking about like borrowing from the idea of quiet quitting. There's a kind of quiet competing that actually might be a sort of competitive advantage now for the museum. I'm thinking about like, right, we have like, you know, little groups of like teenagers who give up their phones and they call themselves Luddites and they only read big novels. There are these like trends that you're like, they're just these little slivers that for me, because that quiet contemplative work is so important, right? And Shaw gave a lecture recently where she talked about moments like right now, how like standing in front of a painting can be kind of life-saving, and it sounds like an exaggeration, but actually in the kind of spectacularized world, we don't get a choice but to live in. There is a way that I think I see people maybe turning their backs on the spectacle a little bit. I mean, for me, I see it in myself, but I think I see it also in like a willingness to spend time deep reading, close reading a work of art, wanting to sit in front of a painting. Anyway, I was thinking of like quiet computing, right? It's sort of like, I don't love the term quiet quitting because it usually just means being kind of unethical to people you're supposed to serve, but like quiet computing is maybe a nice term.
Again, we haven't talked about the funding structure of institutions in Europe. Museums tend to be funded through taxpayer money, which means that at least salaries and your electricity and the building is paid for, and whatever funds you have to raise might go towards an exhibition or acquiring a work of art. Whereas here in the United States, museums have to every year go out and find the money to pay their employees. It's a very different kind of pressure. And so the gravitational pull, and I think as James Voorhees also mentions in the introduction to his book, the way in which, the kinds of exhibition experiences that were previously labeled relational aesthetics, go down the slide in the museum, have a meal, spend the night or something else, has been co-opted also by marketing departments in museums and other institutions because it's a draw. It allows them to bring people in. So an art form that was meant to be about the now, of being in the moment, of having that perhaps a very different kind of experience, is turned into something else, is turned and marketed in a far more spectacularized way in order to help an institution generate money. And I love the idea of anyone hopping on the bandwagon and saying, come to the museum for some serious quiet time. Sadly, that does not sell yet. But the one thing I'm curious about is, how many people here in the room would say, happily pick up a book or your Kindle or screen and read for pleasure for like up to 2 hours in one sitting. All right, that's because you are serious students. If I look at my kids, who are in their early 20s, I also know of a lot of people who have real attention deficit disorder because of the way in which we're constantly checking TikTok, shop for shoes, order your bra or your condoms or whatever else it is while you're sitting in the seminar room, or even in front of the TV, I am not sure. But there is a kind of state of distractedness that has a really detrimental impact, I think, to our lives overall, because the ability to really stay focused, which you have to be if you want to be reading, is really important. And yes, to your point, Kathleen, if you're in front of a painting, whether it's something that's really poetic and meditative, or something else where you're like, I'm going to sit in front of this painting for the next 10 or 15 minutes, and you would be amazed what you actually notice after the first 5 minutes. It's very different to what I call the drive-by viewing, where people go more like, that's a very different experience. So I think, yes, there's so many things you can gain. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, sorry, there's not enough time, Claire Bishop's essay about radical museology is already more than 10 years old, and I wistfully read it again the other day because she makes this big and really wonderful kind of, it's not a claim, it's more like a hopeful wish that more museums could actually move away from just showing the contemporary and rather enter into a dialectical exchange between historical material and contemporary ones. And of course that is an advantage if you are a collecting institution and you have a historical collection. And she singled out 3 examples. Of course, all of them were European institutions that took a very particular political viewpoint and used, so the Reina Sofia in Madrid was one example, when Manolo was still the curator there, they would look back at the history of, say, fascism, and they have famous paintings like Picasso's Guernica, contextualize all of that with ephemeral materials, videos, and other materials. So it's a real deep dive, an opportunity for people to have a rich and thoughtful experience in museums. However, most of the examples that she singled out have since morphed into something else, and that's, just to the point that we have to keep asking new questions, right? Nothing will ever sit still, and either what is relevant, and also, some of the institutions lost their funding. This concept of radical museology is what she's positing. Is certainly daring, but it works when you are in a place that's funded and you are given the latitude and perhaps can fly a little bit under the radar. Otherwise, the financial and other pressures can kind of be a hindrance at some point in time. But I just wanted to mention that one more time. Yes, yeah. But I would really encourage all of you, especially if you're thinking about curatorial work, it's not only about, you're telling a story visually, right? Which is different from telling a story in writing. It's how the different things in one gallery or from one room into the next relate to each other. But the telling the story is not just about, like a biographical narrative. It can be a visual narrative, and some of it can also be purely aesthetic. You can curate with any material. It can be text, it can be photographs, it can be ephemera, it can be paintings and sculptures, obviously, but you should feel liberated, especially in a space like Evergreen, to really dream big and be bold. I think that's exactly what we need. Thank you.